The morning lay pale and thin across the land, the kind of light that seemed to touch everything but warm nothing. Caleb Merrick guided his bay gelding down the worn track to the river, the saddle leather creaking in slow rhythm with the horses' stride. A frost had settled in the grass, glinting like scattered shards of glass beneath the first color of dawn. He had come to check the cattle crossing before the thaw loosened the river's edges. But as the gelding's hooves sank into the damp earth near the reeds, something stopped him cold. There, half hidden in the tall stalks, a woman lay curled. Upon herself, her back to the water. A faded gray shawl wrapped her shoulders, pulled tight as if to keep her bones from coming apart. Beside her sat a cradle rough-hewn from pine, its edges worn smooth by hands that had touched it countless times. The cradle was empty. The stillness of that emptiness seemed louder than the river's low rush. Caleb reined in, studying her. Without moving forward, she was small, though the stubborn way her spine held straight against the cold told him she was not fragile. Her boots were cracked, the stitching frayed, the toes dusted white with frost. Loose strands of dark hair clung to her cheek, damp from the night air. He thought of turning his horse and riding on. This was no business of his. But his gaze lingered on the cradle. He dismounted, boots sinking into the mud, and approached without sound. Only when he was near enough to see the faint steam of her breath did he speak. "Ma'am." Her eyes snapped open gray as the winter. Skyanned in an instant, her hands clutched the cradle's sides, as though a child lay within and might be carried off. She shifted onto one knee, her shawl slipping to reveal a dress the color of old wheat. Mended more times than he could count. "I mean no harm," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. She stared at him, her gaze sharp despite the weariness. In her face. "Who are you?" "Caleb Merrick. I've a ranch at Priver." He nodded toward the horse standing behind him, reins loose. "You shouldn't be here in this cold. I'll manage." Her voice carried no tremor, only a flat certainty. Caleb's eyes moved again to the cradle. "Where's the child?" Her jaw tightened. "That's my concern." He could have pressed, but the line of her shoulders warned him off. "There's room in my wagon. You can ride as far as the next turnoff, if you've somewhere to be." She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. The wind slid in off the water, lifting the ends of her hair, and for a moment she closed her eyes against it. "I'll ride," she said at last. "Only as far as you go." Caleb fetched the gelding, watching her as she stood and adjusted the shawl over her head. The cradle she lifted with both hands, holding it close as she stepped toward him. He saw then that the pine was weathered by years of sun and rain. The inside lined with a quilt so worn the colors had faded to ghosts. He helped her into the saddle and swung up behind, his hands light on the reins. She gave her name Laron, nothing more. The river bent away behind them as they rode, the sound of it fading into the hush of open land. Frost still clung to the edges of the cottonwoods, their bare branches catching the first amber wash of the sun. The trail wound between low hills where sagebrush hunched in the snow, and each breath of wind carried the dry, resinous scent of it. Ilara sat straight in the saddle, the cradle resting across her lap. She looked ahead, not once back toward the river. Caleb, used to riding in silence, found it suited him. Yet he was aware of her in every small shift of weight, every tightening of her fingers on the cradle's rim. They passed a line of fence posts leaning like tired men. Hawk drifted. Above them, its shadow sliding over the ground. Somewhere far to the west, smoke rose in a thin gray thread. The scent faint but distinct cedar burning in some unseen hearth. Caleb felt the urge to speak. But no words came that would not trespass, he thought, instead of the grave behind his barn, marked only by a river stone, and the small wooden cross his own hands had carved years ago. He had buried silence with his wife. Now that silence seemed to ride between them. By mid-morning, the roofs of his ranch buildings broke the line of the horizon. Faded red boards, a corral gate swinging open, the low shadow of the barn lying across the yard. He glanced at Ilara. Her eyes moved over it all without reaction, as if weighing whether it was safe to step inside that space. The horse slowed as they reached the yard. Caleb swung down, taking the cradle from her arms before helping her dismount. For an instant her hand rested on his forearm light, cold through the fabric of his coat before she stepped away. "This way," he said, gesturing toward the porch. Ilara followed, her boots leaving faint prints in the frost-dusted dirt. The wind had died, leaving only the faint creak of the barn door and the quiet breath of the land. Behind them, the river ran on. Unseen, carrying secrets neither had spoken, both too heavy for the morning to bear. The ranch lay quiet under a pale winter sun, the air still enough to carry the faint creak of the windmill turning above the well. Ilara moved through the place like a shadow that did not wish to be caught, her shawl always pulled close, her steps light on the worn plank floors. She rarely sat for long, and when she did, her eyes drifted often to the far horizon, as though she were listening for the sound of hooves or the crack of a rifle from some unseen pursuer. Caleb kept his distance, content to let her keep her silence. But more than once, as he returned from the barn or the far pasture, he found her by the hearth, the cradle beside her chair. She would lean forward slightly, lips moving in quiet words he could not hear. Once the tone was so soft it was almost like a lullaby, though the cradle lay as empty as the day he'd first seen it. When she noticed him in the doorway, her hands stilled, and she shifted the cradle a little closer to the fire, as if to warm what was not there. Late one morning, the crunch of wagon wheels on the frozen yard brought Caleb to the porch. Martha, his neighbor from 2 miles downriver, climbed down with a burlap sack slung over one arm. She was a broad-shouldered woman with wind-burned cheeks and a way of speaking that brooked no argument. "I brought flour and a bit of salt pork," said, glancing past Caleb toward the open door. "Heard you might need it?" Ilara stood inside, her figure framed by the shadow of the doorway. Martha's gaze lingered on her, narrowing slightly in recognition. "Well now," she murmured, "I've seen you before. In town there was." "Talk, Martha," Caleb cut in, his voice low but firm. But the older woman pressed on. "Your man was that traitor, wasn't he? Dealt between us and the Lakota? Well, folks said he was shot in a quarrel over a wagon load of goods. Some say the child was taken." Her eyes flicked to the cradle by the hearth. "No one knew for certain who took him." Ilara's shoulders stiffened beneath the shawl. She didn't answer. Caleb felt the weight in the air shift, the cold from outside creeping into the room despite the fire. Martha, sensing she had stepped somewhere unwelcome, muttered a farewell and left the sack on the table before heading back to her wagon. When the door closed, Caleb stood by the table for a long moment, his hands resting on the rough wood. Memory pulled him backward back to the small mound of earth behind his barn, the feel of a shovel biting into frozen ground. The wooden cross he'd carved for a child who had not lived long enough for a name. That evening, Ilara stayed outside longer than usual. Caleb found her on the porch, leaning against the rail, her gaze fixed on the snow line that rimmed the distant hills. The last light of day bled gold into the sky, setting the frost on the grass aglow. "They're saying it in town, aren't they?" she said without turning. "He didn't answer. They think I lost him to them. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened on the rail. "That cradle was his. I intend to find him, but I don't yet know the path I have to ride." Caleb studied her profile, the way her jaw held its shape, even when the words came like stones. She did not look at him, and he did not press her for more. He stepped past her to the door, pausing only to strike a match against the jamb. The flame caught, and the porch lamp bloomed to life, its light spilling out into the encroaching dark. He left it burning as he went inside, the glow stretching toward her like a silent promise. The first flakes began to fall before midday, fine as sifted flour drifting down from a sky the color of pewter. Caleb had been splitting wood when the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of snow and earnest.
Ow.
By the time he stacked the last log under the eaves, the horizon had vanished into a blur of white. He knew it would be a long night. From the yard came the distant, uneven rhythm of hoofbeats. A dark shape emerged from the storm. A rider bent low over his horse's neck. Caleb stepped off the porch, the cold biting at his cheeks. As the figure drew closer, he saw the beaded fringe of a winter coat, the long braids dusted with snow, the familiar scar running from the left cheekbone to the corner of the mouth. "Nakoma," Caleb called over the wind. The Lakota rider swung down, his breath steaming in the cold. "Storm comes fast," he said in English, thickened by the cadence of his own tongue. "Need shelter?" Caleb nodded, gesturing toward the barn for the horse and the cabin for the man. "You'll find it here." Inside, Alara was tending the fire. She turned at the sound of boots on the floor, her eyes narrowing in recognition. Nakoma's gaze fixed on her, a flicker of surprise passing over his features. "I know you," he said, setting his gloves on the table. Last summer, near the valley trail." Lara stepped closer, her shawl slipping back from her shoulders. "You saw me?" Nakoma shook his head. "Not you. A child. Boy, near 2 winters old. Tear. Like yours, in our camp. My cousin's wife keeps him. She has no children." The words seemed to root Alara to the spot. She gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles pale. Caleb watched the air shift between them, heavy with something more powerful than the storm. But the wind outside was rising, rattling the shutters and sifting snow through the gaps in the eaves. Caleb closed the door against the cold and set another log on the fire. The flames jumped, painting the walls with restless shadows. They shared the evening meal in silence at first bread. Coffee and the dried meat Nakoma had brought from his saddlebag. It was seasoned with smoke and something sharp that lingered on the tongue. Caleb poured coffee for each of them, the steam curling up into the dim lamplight. After a time, Nakoma spoke again, his voice low. "My sister died when the snows came, years ago. She left a child, a girl. She was given to another family. They fed her, clothed her, taught her the songs. She grew strong." His eyes met Alara's across the table. "A child can live without the one who gave them life, if they are loved." Alara's gaze did not waver, though her hand drifted to the cradle beside her chair. Her fingertips traced the worn rim, moving slowly over the smooth pine. The firelight caught the faint sheen in her eyes, though no tears fell. The wind rose to a howl, shaking the cabin as if to test its strength. The lamplight swayed, shadows bending across the walls. Outside, the snow thickened, blotting out the world beyond the window panes. Inside, the air was warm but taut, as though the storm had found its way beneath the roof and settled in the spaces between words. Caleb sat back in his chair, letting the two of them speak as they would. Had known Nakoma for years, back when trade was steady and the valley trails safe to ride. They had hunted together once, shared the meat of a deer by a riverside fire. Trust in his experience was not given lightly across the divide between their peoples. A Nakoma had come here. Speaking of a child meant something. The night wore on. From time to time, Nakoma rose to tend the fire, his movements unhurried but certain. Alara remained by the cradle, the flames gilding her profile. She did not ask the questions that pressed in on her, perhaps sensing that the answers would wait for the storm to pass. When Caleb finally banked the fire for the night, the wind still rattled the shutters, but there was a calm within the cabin that had not been there before, quiet born not from comfort, but from the fragile thread of understanding now stretched between them. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip on the land, leaving behind a pale sky and drifts piled high against the barn. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but the wind had gone, replaced by a hush that seemed to settle over everything. Caleb stepped outside to break the ice from the water trough, his breath hanging white in the stillness. Inside the cabin, the smell of coffee drifted from the hearth. When he came back in, Alara was seated close to the fire, her back to him. In the quiet, he watched her hands move through the strands of her hair, weaving them into a single, neat braid. The simple motion caught him off guard. There was something steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial in the way she smoothed each section before folding it over. She tied the end with a strip of cloth, then let it fall down her back. It was the first time he'd seen her without the shawl drawn up around her face. "You'll be heading to the valley." "Right." Then he said, not as a question, but as an inevitability. She looked over her shoulder, eyes measuring him. "If what Nakoma says is true, yes. It's not a road you should ride alone," he said. "I'll take you." Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment before she turned back to the fire. "You don't know what waits there." "I know enough," Caleb said, "and it's not my first time among them." Later that day, Martha came by with a basket of eggs, her boots clotted with snow. She set them on the table and stood with her hands on her hips. "You'd best be careful, Caleb Merrick. Folks are saying you're about to plant yourself in the middle of their disputes." "This isn't about disputes," he answered. "It's about what's right." Martha gave a short, disbelieving snort. "Right and wrong get tangled quick out here. You go riding into their camp, you'll stir up more than you mean to." Ilara was in the corner by the hearth, mending a tear in her skirt. She kept her head bent, but Caleb knew she'd heard every word. When Martha left, the cabin felt quieter than before. Caleb went to hang his coat by the door, and as he turned, he caught Ilara watching him, not with suspicion this time, but with something steadier, as if she were weighing him and finding his words worth believing. That night, he took a broken stirrup into the barn to repair it, the lantern casting a warm circle of light over the workbench. The leather was cracked, the buckle worn, but it would hold if mended right. He was threading the strap when he sensed movement in the doorway. Ilara stood there, the cold from outside curling in around her. She stepped forward without speaking, her hand in the pocket of her skirt. When she withdrew it, she held out a strip of dark leather, worn soft with use. "This was my husband's," she said. "From his saddle, I thought you could make use of it." Caleb took it carefully, the leather warm from her hand. "Thank you," he said. It meant more than the words aloud. She didn't lay long enough for him to loop the thong through the stirrup buckle and pull it snug. When she left, the scent of cold air lingered in her place, and the barn felt a little less empty. The cold set in deep as they left the ranch behind, the sky a hard sweep of winter blue. Frost clung to the edges of the sage. Each breath from their horses turned to pale clouds that hung in the air before drifting away. Caleb rode slightly. Ahead, breaking the trail where the snow lay thickest, the steady rhythm of hooves muffled under the white. Ilara followed close, her shawl drawn tight, the cradle tied to her saddle with care. By mid-afternoon they came upon the charred skeleton of a cabin, its roof gone, its timbers blackened and brittle. Caleb slowed, memories stirring with the sight. He had traded here once, back when the land still felt a little less divided, before the bitterness of recent years had taken root. Ilara dismounted without a word, and walked to the doorway that stood without a door. She stood there with her eyes closed, the wind whispering through the empty frame, carrying the faint creak of loose boards. Caleb waited, giving her the space to let the moment pass, but she did not move on quickly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though the cold in it was sharper than the air. "They say my husband died because the Lakota shot him. That's the story folks tell." She opened her eyes, looking out across the barren stretch beyond the cabin. But it was another settler who killed him, a man he trusted. There was silver to be made in breaking the trade, and he wanted it for himself. Caleb said nothing at first, letting her words stand. Then he asked, "Why not tell it plain?" Her gaze shifted toward him. "Truth doesn't always serve the ones left behind. It only makes the nights longer." They left the cabin behind, pressing on until the light began to fade. The cold deepened, and Caleb spotted a rise sheltered by a stand of pines. There they made camp, the fire crackling into life as night closed around them. The flames cast their faces in shifting gold, the shadows rising and falling with each flicker. Caleb sat across from her, the heat touching his cheeks, the smell of smoke clinging to his coat. She held her hands out to the fire, palms open, eyes fixed on the embers. "I never thought I'd have anyone beside me again," he said quietly. "Not after my wife. I figured I'd just ride out my years with the work and the land." Looked at her, the fire catching in the dark of her eyes. "But I was wrong about what I could feel." She didn't look away, but her jaw tightened. "I can't think about anything past finding my boy. The rest, it's not mine to hold yet." "I know," he said. When his hand reached across the narrow space between them, she didn't pull back. Her fingers were cool against his palm, but they didn't tremble. They sat like that for a long while, the fire's warmth circling them. the night around them wide and cold above. The stars cut sharp through the darkness, and the sound of the wind in the pines carried the faint promise of something that might grow if given the chance. The camp lay in a hollow between two ridges, smoke from the lodges curling into the pale morning sky. Their approach was met with watchful eyes, but no weapons were raised. Caleb dismounted first, helping Alara down before leading the horses. Toward the center of the clearing, Coma stepped forward from among his people, his breath a white plume in the cold. He spoke in his own tongue to an older man, then turned to address Alara. "I will speak for you," she nodded, her hands tightening on the cradle strap slung across her shoulder. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and cooking meat, the murmur of children's laughter threading through the air. Caleb stood beside her, silent, feeling the weight of the moment press between his shoulder blades. A woman emerged from one of the lodges, a small boy balanced on her hip. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his dark hair falling in soft curls over his forehead. The instant his eyes found Alara, he wriggled free from the woman's arms and stumbled across the snow. Alara dropped to her knees before he reached her, her arms opening wide. The boy crashed into her embrace, his small hands fisting in her shawl. She wept into his hair, the sound raw and quiet, rocking him gently, as if afraid he might vanish if she'd let go. The woman who had cared for him stood a few paces away, her expression neither bitter nor reluctant. Alara rose and crossed to her, speaking words haltingly in the Lakota tongue, her voice shaking but steady enough to convey gratitude. She touched her forehead to the woman's, a gesture Caleb recognized from Nakoma's own people, and stepped back. No coins were offered, no bargain was struck. Only a simple understanding that the boy might return one day to visit, to know where he had been kept safe when the world had left him unprotected. They left the camp as the first thin flakes of snow began to fall, drifting in lazy spirals. From a white sky, Caleb rode close, his eyes on the boy now wrapped in a thick quilt and sleeping in Alara's arms. The trail was silent but for the soft creak of leather and the muffled sound of the horses' hooves in the fresh powder. After a long stretch, Alara glanced at him, her expression softer than he had seen it. "If your offer still stands, I'll stay at the ranch, at least for the winter." He didn't answer right away, only reached for her reins and placed them gently in her hands. "Then you lead the way back." She looked down at the boy, then ahead to the open plain. A faint smile touched her lips as she urged her horse forward. Caleb followed, letting her set the pace, the snow falling heavier now, closing the distance between them and the rest of the world. By the time the riverbank came into view, the day was already leaning toward dusk. The place where he had first found her was marked only by the curve of the shore and the reeds bowing under their burden of snow. In the wagon bed, the cradle rested once more, but it was no longer empty. Blankets lined its interior, and the sound of the boy's small, bright laughter rose above the quiet rush of the river. Caleb looked at Alara then, the reins loosened. Her hands, her posture no longer held in that rigid guard he had seen so often before. Something had shifted, earned, not given. And in that small change lay the promise of a winter that might hold more than survival. They crossed the river together, the current dark beneath the ice, the snow falling in soft veils around them. Somewhere ahead, the warm glow of the ranch waited, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt as though he was riding toward something instead of away.